Awareness, the final frontier. These are the explorations of Jonathan Robinson and Brian Tom O'Connor. Their continuing mission, to discover fresh new paths to the mystery within, to seek out new joys and new methods of awakening, to boldly go into the heart of expanded consciousness. This is Awareness Explorers.
Well, welcome back, friends, to another episode of Awareness Explorers. I'm Jonathan Robinson. I'm with my co-host,
Brian Tom O'Connor.
And I just got back from New York, where I was visiting Brian. And if you heard our last podcast, we managed to interview one of the most known teachers of non-dual awareness, Rupert Spira, and it was exciting for us, and I hope all of you listened to it and got value from it. And before we go into today's topic, I just want to review a couple of things that I got from that, Brian, and maybe a little bit of what you learned from it as well. First of all, Rupert is obviously a really wonderful soul. His energy comes through as being very kind. And I like, in particular, watching him answer your question about creativity, because he seemed to be so much speaking to you and the sincerity of your question, and somehow in his answer lifted you from concern right into the upper realms of pure awareness. And I was wondering what that was like for you.
Yes, I always feel that way when I listen to Rupert. When I listen to him, I try as much as possible to listen from the background of pure awareness, as opposed to listening from the conceptual mind or trying to figure out what he means, which when I first started listening to him, I admit I used to do. I used to spend a lot of time figuring out the concepts and trying to understand them, and often my mind would argue with him. And after a while, that quieted down, and I just listen, even when he's answering someone else's question. I just listen from awareness, and I find that I arrive at that place of joy and peace pretty easily. And this time I thought it was very interesting because he talked a lot about how everyone is different, and yet how the message ends up being the same. In other words, we may start where each person is, but the ending point is the same for everybody, which is our true nature as awareness.
Yeah, you say that really well. And you make another interesting point, which is that you can listen to somebody from different places. You can listen to like agree or disagree. You can listen from your heart, or you can listen from pure awareness as best you can. And they all lead to completely different results. So it's almost like you could listen to the same lecture 4 different times and it would have 4 different effects on you. So I find that interesting and a useful point to make, because we sometimes get in the habit of listening from our heads versus our hearts versus our gut versus awareness. So that's one thing that I found interesting about what you just said. And the other thing is the specificity of how he kind of was able to tune into you and answer your question in a way that first got incredible amounts of rapport with you and trust, and then was able to, with his words, just kind of guide you into an open space. I found it interesting because what he said to you definitely did not apply to me. And it was really geared towards you. And if you remember last time we talked, he kind of pointed out something to me, because I asked him a theoretical question. Like the question was, well, if somebody comes to you and they have a relationship problem, what do you do? Or what do you say? And I found it fascinating that he kind of said, I can't answer that in a theoretical way. There is no set method, there's no mechanical method that I use. It requires that I be present, that I tune into that person, and from the aliveness of that moment, guide them to a better place. And I found that so valuable in feedback for me, because sometimes I'm like this rote mechanic that just wants to know the method. But his view that it's very dependent on the sincerity of the question. It's dependent on where that person is at for him to know how to tune into the aliveness of that moment to take somebody to where they need to go. That was just very valuable feedback for me. And you had a funny reaction to that feedback. You want to tell people what that was?
Yeah, sure. I did find that very, very interesting because after he answered my question, well, after you asked that question and he said he had a hard time answering it because it was general, I said, well, let me ask a question about my life. And so I asked him a question pertaining to being a creative artist and promoting oneself and the ego. And that triggered a very specific and detailed and very interesting answer from him. And then you responded and said, yes, I did get a lot out of that. And then he went on to talk to you about it. And he said, well, don't get me wrong, I mean no disrespect, but your question was general and it left me cold. And then afterwards, you and I were talking about that. And I was shocked because if he had said that to me, I would have felt really bad. And I said, so how do you feel about it, Jonathan? And you said, oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's about 0.2. I was so surprised.
A
So,
0.2 in terms of feeling bad about it. It was
yes,
like a 10 in terms of feeling good about it.
yes, that's what I meant. In terms, 0.2 in terms of feeling bad about it, exactly. And so I realized that this is a difference between you and me in terms of how we react to feedback and criticism. And I think perhaps that I and our listeners might have something to learn from you in that department.
Well, thank you. My background is I was with a teacher for 25 years who focused on showing people their obstacles to being pure awareness. That was his method. He said, pure awareness is what is. The only thing you really need to be concerned about is being aware of the obstacles so that they can dissipate. Because if you're aware of the obstacles, you won't go there. They won't have a chance to grow. So he gave me a lot of feedback that was sometimes really difficult to hear, but over time I just learned to really appreciate feedback because it was a helpful maneuver for shrinking things that were in the way of peace and awareness. And I find it interesting that even the word you use is criticism. And that's not a word I would use. If somebody's giving you helpful information, saying that, oh, if you keep doing that, that's going to cause trouble. I don't see it as criticism. I see it as, oh, thank you. I wasn't aware of that. That's very useful. And what I've noticed is that this sense of looking at obstacles and getting feedback from other people is very rare in spiritual circles nowadays. And I think that's a problem because on our own, we can't see everything. It's like if you're married to someone, your husband or wife's faults and psychological things, neuroses better than they do. But only by seeing that stuff does it help to have it grow smaller or dissipate. And I think feedback is a very useful method or skill or ability to receive on the spiritual path. And I'm wondering how you look at it.
I think you're absolutely right. We do need feedback because oftentimes we are looking in the wrong direction. And you need a good, strong, but gentle and kind teacher to say, no, you're looking in the wrong direction. You're trying to figure it out intellectually or conceptually, or you are trying to find ways to fix yourself or fix the world. And the truth of it is that happiness isn't in our achievements or what we can fix or what we can change about ourselves. It is about what knows our experience. And when we ask questions that lead to a detailed conceptual idea of the objects of our experience, meaning our concepts, our thoughts, our achievements, our relationships, they may be actually going in the opposite direction from our true nature, which is the joy and spacious lovingness of awareness itself. And a good teacher can say, no, I think just turn around and look in this direction instead.
That's definitely one type of feedback when people are literally looking in the wrong direction. But another type of feedback is just getting to see your many internal obstacles or shadow sides more clearly. I'll tell you a funny story. For a while, I lived with my teacher with 10 other people for years. And about once a week, he would put somebody in this household on the hot seat. And the hot seat meant that he was kind of detailing to that person everything he saw that was, in a way, wrong with them. Things that were inharmonious, things that they did that they may not have been aware of, like moments that they were selfish or they were coming from a bad motivation or they were sneaky or they weren't saying what they were really thinking, et cetera, et cetera. And he would go into a lot of detail. And the person on the hot seat would often get very defensive and very upset and say, no, that's not true. I wasn't doing it for that reason or whatever. And all of us would watch this. And then he'd say at the end, if you think that, for example, Joe is really like how I just described, and that it's an accurate description of Joe's obstacles, raise your hand. Well, we had been living with Joe for 5 years, so we all raised our hand because what he said was incredibly accurate. And I was always amazed at how accurate he was and how specific he was with everybody, except when I was on the hot seat. When I was on the hot seat, everything he said was a bunch of misunderstandings and not accurate in any way. And then at the end of his berating me with these lies and accusations, he would say, if you think Jonathan is really like this and everything I said was accurate, raise your hand. And the other 9 people in the household would inevitably raise their hand. And I was like amazed, like, what, did he pay these people to raise their hand? Because that's not me at all. But of course, what I eventually saw was that he was accurate and that I did not know myself accurately. I did not know that my motivations were X versus Y. And eventually I started to see that he was right. So by having a more accurate view of the obstacles I had, the motivations I had, those things eventually got smaller and less prominent in my personality. And then there was a little bit more space for pure awareness to shine through. So that was my experience. I'm wondering what you think in terms of that type of, quote, hot seat feedback that I received.
Well, I think it's fascinating that we don't see ourselves the way others see us. And it's not only the negative. We often think we're better at something than others see us, but we often think that we're worse. We think that we have these terrible faults and that we have reason to be ashamed, or we just think that we're great and everything is fine. I think to a certain extent, it's actually healthy to think well of ourselves, but I do think it's useful to sit and get actual true feedback. But either way, the danger here is that it's about the personality and not about the actual deeper self behind the personality. So while I think all of this is very useful and fascinating, uh, I think there is a danger that it can lead you to the fixing, to the self improvement game, as opposed to finding our true nature in the background of all experience, which is awareness itself.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple dangers in getting feedback, and I'd like to explore not only the dangers, but the other benefits I see.
Okay.
First thing you said was that we don't see the negative and we don't see the positive. I agree. So sometimes the most loving person has no idea they're loving because that's just like the air that they're breathing in. And I remember my teacher once said to me, did you know that you write really, really well? I go, I do? He said, yeah, you should write stuff. And I had no idea that I wrote well. I just, it was like breathing. So that was the start of me becoming a writer. And, 14 books later, I guess I write pretty well. It just seems easy for me. And I was not aware of it until he pointed it out. But one of the dangers that you mentioned is that it gets into a focus on self improvement. And it's a case where a little bit is definitely useful and a lot might be really detrimental. Because I think a certain amount of working on the personality and self improvement, as you call it, is useful because sometimes, somebody's really rude and they don't know it and nobody wants to be around them. That rudeness needs to stop if they're going to have any friends in life or have any space for other things to come out. So some of that I think is helpful. The question is how much? And generally people either go fully into self-improvement and they forget about the background of awareness, or they say, you don't need to do any of that stuff. Just focus on the background awareness. And they can get pretty high on that, but they aren't necessarily somebody that you want to spend time around because there's certain quirks of their personality that are so difficult that you just don't want to spend much time around them. What do you think?
Yes, and this actually dovetails into something else that Rupert said in our last podcast, which is that if people, including ourselves, including our loved ones, and including our world leaders, actually knew that we are actually the same underneath. In other words, the self that looks out through my eyes is pure, spacious, unlimited, infinite awareness, and therefore exactly identical with what is looking out through your eyes. And that if everybody knew that and then behaved towards each other with that knowledge, that our interaction would be much more loving, much more peaceful, much more productive. So if that's the kind of self-improvement we're talking about, I'm all for it.
Yeah, yeah. He even said that, once you have this awareness, your job is to take it out into the world so it can grow, so you can create more harmony in, say, your relationships or at your work or in your body, so that you would see clearly some of the things that are inharmonious. And as you see things that are inharmonious, they tend to stop. The analogy I use is if you see a bunch of dog dew on the sidewalk and that's dog dew and you aren't calling it something else, you will not step in it because you know that that would be disgusting. So when we see that our rudeness is hurting us or other people, or when we see that our tendency to hurry, for example, keeps us from being the background of awareness, and we see it over and over and over and over again, then it tends to not happen quite as much because you can't consciously do something to hurt yourself.
Yes, that's right.
So one of the advantages I see of this feedback is it gives you a clearer picture of who you are and what you may be doing that is interfering with either being awareness or interfering with your life in such a way that's creating disharmony, which will then make getting to awareness a little bit more difficult.
Well, I think that either one of them can be very helpful. And that's what it really is all about. It's what's most helpful to each one of us individually for bringing us to greater happiness.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, one quote that I wrote down from the interview with Rupert that really I thought was beautifully put. We were talking about enlightenment, and he said, enlightenment is just the exotic word for happiness.
Mm.
And we talk about awakening and enlightenment and spiritual search and other matters. But what we really are talking about is happiness. So it really is what helps people. And each person is individual. And if certain feedback about looking in the wrong direction for happiness, instead of where happiness really lives, is helpful, then that's what they should get. And if certain feedback about things they're doing in life that are creating obstacles between themselves and others and between themselves and their own happiness, then I think that kind of feedback would be helpful too.
Yeah, but it's surprisingly hard to come by unless you're in a spiritual community. And then even in a spiritual community, it can be hard to come by, because people get defensive, they get triggered. So a question I have is, how do you get that feedback? And one answer is you have to want it. You have to see that's valuable. Getting money is not easy. It doesn't just rain down from the sky, but we all want it, so we figure out a way to get it. And in a similar way, I think of that we all have what I call holes in our balloon, meaning leaks in our balloon. And it only takes a small leak in a balloon, and that balloon will not fill up with air. The balloon could be 99% intact, but if it even has a small leak, you can't fill it up. So part of our job is to find out where those leaks are and to be aware of them and to maybe patch them up as best we can. And in order to do that, it really helps to have friends on the path who you trust to give you honest feedback, who aren't trying to hurt you. And that can be a little bit hard with like a marriage partner, whether, you've been married a long time or a short time. Sometimes it's really hard to get feedback from your partner or somebody you're dating. But I encourage people to have friends that they can say, hey, by the way, have you noticed that you hurry a lot, or that when you eat, you rush through things? I was out with a friend the other day, and he said, do you realize that you rush through your food really quickly? And I said, oh, it's not that bad. Pretty much dismissing him at first. And he said, well, let me put it more clearly. You eat like a pig. And I started laughing, and I said, okay, you're right. It's a problem. I do eat too fast. Thank you. I really appreciate you telling me that, because it was true.
Well, I'm glad you're laughing, and I'm glad you reacted that way. I would not have reacted that way. And I don't actually want that kind of feedback. I don't think it is helpful. And that's where we're different. I don't want to feel bad about myself. But either way, we're concentrating on something about our personality, something about our individual body mind, our imaginary separate self, as opposed to our real true self, to which eating like a pig and eating well is all one and the same. It totally loves us whether we eat fast or whether we eat slow, because it is love, it is acceptance, it is choiceless awareness. But that said, Jonathan, I wouldn't mind some advice on how not to get so triggered when I hear, maybe let's not call it criticism, let's call it slightly negative feedback. Maybe I and our listeners can learn something. What would you say if we wanted to be a little less concerned over criticism or or fear of criticism?
Well, let me ask you a question, Brian, uh,
Okay.
right off the bat. Let's say I asked you this question. Brian, would you be interested in something I've noticed that might be causing you unnecessary stress that I sometimes see that you may not be fully aware of? Is that something you'd be interested in?
I would answer a cautious yes.
Good. So we're live, and I'm going to give you some feedback that way.
Okay.
And realize that that question is really key, because if you want feedback, I think, or if you're going to give feedback, you should ask somebody that question, because forcing feedback on somebody, I think, is a bad idea
Hmm.
always. But if you put it in the right context, hey, I see something, a small thing you're doing that might be causing you unnecessary stress or suffering. Would you like to know what it is? And the person says yes. So you said yes. So I'd say, sometimes I notice that you're a little bit more of a perfectionist than you need to be. And it's also something I appreciate about you, because I tend to be a little bit sloppy. But you might, in wording something, you'll struggle over a word or two, and it causes you, it looks like it causes a little bit of stress, where from my perspective it's not that important. And I wonder if you just kind of see that as potentially something that, I don't know, causes you stress or difficulty that may not always be necessary.
I think it may sometimes cause stress that may not be necessary. The times when it would cause unnecessary stress are the times when I do it because I think that I'm going to be criticized or I'm going to feel ashamed if I don't,
Hmm.
when other people don't care quite as much as I do. So I think in those times, you're absolutely right. I think there are other times when it actually does the opposite. In other words, let's say I'm feeling creative and I'm making something, I'm writing something, and I look at a sentence and it doesn't feel quite right. And I change a word or two and I keep doing it until it really does feel right. Oh, there's a tremendous satisfaction in looking at it and saying, yes, I made that. And it's so much better than it would have been if I had just taken the first thing that came to my mind. So it really is, I think, a double-edged sword. It really is a matter of degree. If we go too far in our perfectionism and we feel that our entire ego is all wrapped up in doing it in order to prevent criticism, then I think it gets in the way. If it's all involved in making something really good that we want to share with the world and feel good about and happy about and be proud of, then I think it can be a positive thing.
Yeah, I agree. And those are good distinctions. And I appreciate that you take what's valuable from what I said, and you see what works for you, and you see what's helpful. And in a way, I got the same thing. My the other side of that is that I am often sloppy, and because I'm impatient. So I recognize when people are doing something much more impeccably or perfectionistically than I would do it. And that's something I need to look at, that, I want to, out of impatience, just hurry through things. So I think in conversations like this amongst friends, people can learn valuable stuff. Hopefully nobody's feelings get hurt. I hope I didn't say anything to offend you. And I think discussions like this are valuable amongst friends as a way to maybe round off sharp edges everybody has, so that we can be more available for service and awareness when and if we get stuck on something.
Yes, and no, you didn't say anything to offend me, and I think it was really good back and forth that we had here. I think that when we know things about ourselves or when things are pointed out about ourselves, it's not so much that we need to fix ourselves, but that knowing it allows us to hold it a little bit lighter.
Good, good. Well, that's the type of thing I think is useful for people to do with friends, to be aware of things that you can't necessarily become that aware of on your own. And what I'd like to do now is a guided meditation that you can do with yourself or your friends to help people become more aware of these leaks in our balloon that keep us from greater happiness and greater awareness. So, does that sound like a good thing to do now?
Great. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. So, if you're in a place where you can close your eyes, then feel free to do so, or just get yourself relaxed and feel your body on your chair or wherever it is. And just allow yourself to relax any tight places in your body. Take a couple of slow, deep breaths. And as best you can, just sink into a deeper place within you, like your heart or your gut, so that you can listen from a deeper place within you for your answers to some questions I'm going to ask you. And when listening to one's intuition, you just listen for any voice or any thought that feels right, or any feeling that feels right and true and helpful. With that in mind, the first question that's good to contemplate is there anything that you're doing that might be hurting yourself or keeping yourself from greater happiness, or hurting other people or keeping them from greater happiness? Just sit with that for a moment. Is there anything that jumps out and says, yeah, it'd be better if I wasn't doing that? It might be something small like hurrying or eating quickly, or it might be workaholism or drugs or whatever. It could be small or big, but is there anything you're doing that keeps you from greater happiness and greater awareness? I'll be silent for a moment while you contemplate that. The second question to ask is there any feedback you might have for a friend that's doing something that might be hurting them or keeping them from greater happiness or awareness, that from your love you could be curious to see if they're interested in knowing and then sharing with them? So, thinking of all the people in your life who might be interested in greater happiness and awareness, can you think of some piece of feedback that someone might benefit from if you asked them if they were interested and they said yes? Take a minute and see if anybody comes to mind. And the last question, is there anything that you can do to have greater happiness or bring in more awareness into your life? Something that would be something that you actively can do that might help you towards your deepest goals? Take a minute and see if any intuitive answer arises to that question. And when you're ready, become once again aware of your body in a chair. If you found some of those answers valuable and you want to write them down, take a moment to do that as you come out of this little meditation. And hopefully feel the excitement of getting valuable information that can help you and others to move forward towards greater happiness and awareness, since that is what we ultimately all want to experience. So that's my little meditation, Brian. How was that for you?
Oh, thank you, Jonathan. It's lovely.
Good.
And I would like to add a reminder for people.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's wonderful to ask these questions, to ask what you can do to bring about more happiness for yourself and for others. But my reminder is to not forget that happiness is not something you do, it's something you are. In other words, your true nature is happiness. So you might ask yourself, well, what am I doing that's bringing me away from happiness and towards forgetting that my true nature, because it is pure awareness, which allows everything to be as it is, and therefore is unconditional love. Happiness is what you are. It's that part of you that is always the same, that allows everything to be as it is, that loves unconditionally, that is always there, that already is happy. That is, in fact, happiness itself.
I'm glad you clarified that, Brian, because it's so easy to lose that, to get off track. And we need all the reminders we can get because we're always being pushed outwards. And yet happiness is always here right now within. Well, I think that wraps up another good discussion. Thank you for exploring this with me, Brian, and getting into some of the nitty-gritty where we can really hash this out and learn from each other and even get feedback from each other. And I think that's the type of stuff we all need to get to the next level of taking this journey to farther and farther reaches of consciousness, awareness, and of service.
Yes, and I find it fascinating that although, as you say, we agree on many, many things, we disagree on some things too. And we're also very different in some areas. And I think that makes for an interesting chemistry, and we do learn from each other. And sometimes we play the devil's advocate for each other. And when we do, it's interesting, and I enjoy it a lot. So thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Well, my friends out there, as we always say, keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
Till next time.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Awareness Explorers. To learn more, you can check out our website at awarenessexplorers.com. Please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite podcast app. And we'd love it if you would post a review. And please share our link on Facebook and with family and friends, because knowing yourself as awareness is the greatest gift you can give yourself or someone you love.